Superior blends of premium coffee. Roasted fresh in Zionsville, Indiana. Darren's Coffee satisfies the casual and the connoisseur. Scott Horton Show listeners, visit darrenscoffee.com and use the coupon code SCOTT at checkout for free shipping. darrenscoffee.com. Because everyone deserves to drink great coffee.
All right, y'all, Scott Horton Show. ScottHorton.org is the website. We got more than 4,000 interviews now, going back to 2003 there at ScottHorton.org. Sign up for the podcast feed for all the new ones, and follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. All right, introducing our good friend Gareth Porter. He's more than 200 of those 4,000 interviews. Geez, maybe 300 by now. I don't know. And for very good reason. He's my most very favorite reporter out of everybody. And I've got a lot of favorite reporters. But Gareth Porter, he's the author of the book on the Iranian nuclear program. It's called Manufactured Crisis: The Truth About the Iranian Nuclear Scare. And then, he's written a ton of great articles all about the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now focusing on Syria. This one is A New Fight Over Syria War Strategy. It's at consortiumnews.com and also at antiwar.com. A very important piece. Welcome back to the show here, Gareth.
Thanks so much, Scott. Glad to be back on the show.
Very happy to have you here. Very complicated war there in Syria. I guess, the listeners of this show more or less understand the breakdown that it's the Assad government and his army, the state army of Syria, allied with Hezbollah, allied with Iran, and allied with Russia. And they're fighting against a basically Al-Qaeda and ISIS-led Sunni-based insurgency, which is backed by the United States, Turkey, Saudi, Qatar, and Israel. To some degrees, over time, this fluctuates. I'll let you clarify. And then, of course, also, America and Russia are backing the Kurds and are attacking the Islamic State and have been bombing the Islamic State for the last 2 years since they declared their caliphate, based out of Raqqa in eastern Syria and Mosul in western Iraq. So now we're trying to figure out how to end this war short of one side, declaring a complete and total victory, because apparently that's not in the cards. We need some kind of negotiated peace here, or we need some kind of change in strategy by, America, Russia, or some of the major powers to change the game on the ground to get this thing over with one way or the other before it turns into a 15-year Lebanon-length civil war here, Gareth. So tell us, please, what is going on?
Well, I think you're absolutely right in your overall summary, except for, sort of the distinction between ISIS and Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra Front, of course, is not simply that they're two variants of the Al-Qaeda based theme, but rather that they are on different sides of the war, in the sense that ISIS and Al-Nusra Front are rivals for the ultimate prize of gaining power in Syria, rather than allies in the struggle against Assad. In other words, there are really three sides to the war, or maybe four sides if you include the Kurds, and that does indeed make it a very complicated conflict, and makes it more difficult to figure out what the end game is going to look like. I would say, however, that if there's one possibly hopeful sign on the horizon, it is that the Turkish government of President Erdogan is now rethinking its policy towards Syria. It's not ready to give up its support for Al-Nusra Front, clearly, at this point. On the other hand, there is this distinct possibility, although perhaps a small possibility, that Turkey could approach the Russians, and I think they probably already have approached the Russians, about the possibility of a deal under which Assad would remain in power, but would have to take away that is to say, the Russians putting the pressure on Assad and using their own military power would have to force the Kurds to give up their demand for autonomy in the area along the Turkish-Syrian border, the northern border of Syria, next to Turkey. And that's a long shot, but that is one possibility that is beginning to be discussed as a solution that could provide the basis for Turkey to say, okay, we'll shut down the lifeline to the al-Nusra Front and its allies. So I just wanted to throw that in there as.
Well, and they've already cut off ISIS, right? There was a time where the Turks were happy to let ISIS raise money there. We're happy to leave their border wide open to them. We're happy to buy black market oil from them.
I think that's right. I mean, at this point, the Turks have cut off Al-Qaeda, cut off ISIS, and therefore ISIS has turned on them and, of course, started to carry out terrorist bombings of the terrible nature against Turkey.
Mm-hmm. Man, so I'm trying to keep my scorecard straight here. So now in this article, now you're talking about a proposal that the Russians offered to the Americans, somewhat along these same lines as what you're talking about, maybe this deal between the Russians and the Turks.
Well, what the Russians were proposing to the United States was that, let's the two of us get together and, carry out an air campaign, against al-Nusra Front that would really, weaken it significantly. And, the premise of it would be that the non-jihadist parts of the factions, if you will, of the armed opposition to Assad would retreat from or would separate themselves physically and organizationally from al-Nusra Front, would cease the close military cooperation, including direct participation in the military planning with al-Nusra Front that they have been carrying out in the past. And that would then allow both the United States and the Russian air forces to cooperate in carrying out a more effective campaign against al-Nusra Front. Now, the U.S. has, as I understand it, never said simply no to that, but they've always wanted to have some further conditions imposed on the arrangement. And that's what we now see covered in my story about the Obama administration's response diplomatically to the Russian plan. And that was provided or given to the Russians on June 27th. And in that proposal, according to both the Washington Post article as well as other news media coverage of it, the Obama administration wants the Russians to essentially, as one source put it, not my source, but a published source put it, they want to ground the air force of the Assad regime, and that's obviously putting it in the strongest terms. It would mean that the Assad regime would not be carrying out further bombing. Now, I don't think that's going to be acceptable to. Clearly, that's not going to be acceptable to the Russians. But more explicitly, what my understanding is that the Obama administration was demanding that the Russians agree that there would be no bombing, further bombing of the areas controlled by the U.S. clients, is the way I'm going to put it, the armed clients of the CIA in Syria, after this agreement would go into effect. So that leaves a lot of questions unanswered, obviously, and this was really where my article sets out to try to discern what it is that's really going on here. So, my article basically says that the folks who have the hard line in the Obama administration on Syria, who want the Obama administration to either use military force against Assad or carry out a much more aggressive program of military assistance to the armed opposition, or both, are very much opposed to this, and that includes the Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, who has made it known that he doesn't like this proposal. But clearly factions within the CIA, and I think it's clearly those folks who are responsible for the covert operation in Syria, the so-called covert operation of aiding the armed opposition in Syria, they're opposed to this because it carries them further away from where they want to be, which is a much more aggressive program. Yeah. So, we know that there are factions within the Obama administration who are opposing this. But I further raised the question of how serious is the Obama administration about really wanting to go ahead with this kind of program? I have serious questions about that.
All right. Now, so Gareth, the other thing is, so the CIA backs these different groups, but to what degree can they really tell them what to do? In other words, if America, say Obama instructed the CIA to instruct the mythical moderates to, now we really mean it. Separate yourself from al-Nusra because we're about to bomb al-Nusra. Can he even get them to do that? Or are they just going to say, no, we're down with al-Nusra and not with you because you're going to end up stabbing us in the back anyway. And so, and this has been the problem all along, or really they haven't tried to separate them out from al-Nusra like in the deal from a few months ago.
Yeah, I think the point here is that if the United States is not willing to tell its allies, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, no more arming of the opposition groups if they're not going to cooperate with the ceasefire, then those groups are not going to pay attention to what the United States says. And I think that's exactly what has happened in the past, that the U.S., sort of parrots the line that, yes, we support a ceasefire and we expect all groups who have signed up for the ceasefire, meaning the groups that are our clients, to participate in this and to separate themselves from the al-Nusra Front. But in fact, John Kerry knows very well that they're not going to do it as long as they can count on the external regional allies to continue their policy of providing a lifeline from across the Turkish border. And of course, as long as they're able to, get through against the Russian and Syrian bombing. But I think that's correct that the U.S. clients are not going to comply with that because they don't see it as in their interest, and they believe that they can continue on the present course because they have the support of Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. So they really do have some strings to pull. CIA actually probably could boss them around, but they would have to crack down on their allies and have their allies crack down on the mythical moderates, and they're just not willing to do that, is what you're telling me.
That's exactly right, and this has been the crux of the matter ever since this program began in 2013, or even earlier, depending on how you date it. The United States has been part of a coalition, and it has valued its alliances with the regional allies more than it does peace in Syria or any other interest. And that, in my view, is the real problem with U.S. Middle East policy, that the U.S. does not really care about. I mean, can I use the ASS word? It does not give a rat's ass about the Syrian people or about a peace in Syria. It values primarily being able to have access to the Incirlik air base in Turkey, access to the Bahrain naval base, which is controlled by Saudi Arabia, right, and access to the crucial land and air bases in Qatar. So, I mean, this is...
So what you're saying is when Obama finally decides to stop deliberately backing terrorists, he can't because all of our satellite tails are wagging the imperial dog.
Well, I mean, I don't think that terrorism has really been the primary interest here for many years, in fact. But yeah, the point is that the
al-Nusra guys target civilians with suicide attacks and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah,
the Arar al-Sham massacres people for having the wrong religion. What am I missing?
Well, we are in de facto using the terrorists in al-Nusra Front as a basis for the policy in Syria, have been since 2012 or 2013, and therefore, I would argue and have argued that terrorism is not terrorism / counterterrorism is not the reason the United States is doing anything in Syria.
I understand what you mean. Yeah, I'm sorry. I misunderstood what you meant by that, but I understand what you're saying. Our war on terrorism is not what's relevant. But yeah, that's not what I was talking about either. I was talking about our war for terrorism, for Christ's sake.
Neither counterterrorism nor the concern about civilians in Syria, nor the concern about stability in the Middle East have anything to do with, or our governing concerns about U.S. policy. It is continuing to maintain the United States as a regional hegemon, a regional superpower, and that demands access to these bases. It demands the continuation of the military status quo in that sense. So I continue to believe that is what controls the U.S. policy in the Middle East. And again, Obama is merely a kind of steward of that continuous policy rather than someone who ever intended to really upset the apple cart.
Right. Well, yeah, and, I hope I didn't sound like some kind of Trumpian birther saying that Obama's a secret Muslim terrorist or whatever. He obviously is pursuing these interests doing the very same thing Ronald Reagan did, which is backing these guys in order to accomplish American goals.
Yeah, except that in fact Reagan was more progressive, quote unquote, in the sense of recognizing reality and being upset about, in the case of Reagan's policy, what the Israelis were doing, and was willing to say publicly, "Hey, we got to stop that. The Israelis have got to stop this." He was in fact more reality oriented in his own way, at least during the early 1980s, than Obama has proven to be. And that's, I think, a very telling point about the nature of U.S. national security policy over these decades.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw a clip of Ronald Reagan talking about how the Israelis ought to get out of the West Bank. I couldn't believe it. And that was par for the course for a Republican president back in the 80s. Wow.
Last night I saw a screening of a new film on the occupation of the American mind.
That's where I saw the clip. Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
That reminds me.
And this was, we saw the same clip of Reagan. Yeah.
Hey, all, Scott Horton here. It's always safe to say that one should keep at least some of your savings in precious metals as a hedge against inflation. And if this economy ever does heat back up and the banks start expanding credit, rising prices could make metals a very profitable bet. Since 1977, Robertson Roberts Brokerage Inc. has been helping people buy and sell gold, silver, platinum, and palladium, and they do it well. They're fast, reliable, and trusted for more than 35 years. And they take Bitcoin. Call Robertson Roberts at 1-800-874-9760 or stop by rrbi.co.
Yeah, I mean, I was just a kid then. I didn't remember that, but I didn't know anything about it. But yeah, that was really something else to see him and being so frank about it the way he was being too. This was serious business. He wasn't he wasn't making a soft suggestion or something.
Various memoirs record the fact that Reagan really was personally very upset about what the Israelis did. He did not understand. He had simply not understood what was really going on there. And when he understood it, he was quite upset. And, that was an interesting moment, shall we say, in U.S. national security policy that took place.
Absolutely. All right. Now, so let me get back to Ash Carter for a minute here. This guy was sold when they got rid of Chuck Hagel and they brought in Ash Carter to be the Secretary of Defense. They basically sold him as a wonk. Like he's a mathematician and he's a physicist and he's a technocrat and nobody knows his name, but he's going to be the placeholder until the next administration, basically. We're not going to have any more stars. We're promoting this guy from inside the Pentagon. And there was, the story that he had advocated an attack on North Korea and a couple of other things that made people wonder maybe there was a bit of an ideology here. But from where I'm sitting, it seems like, and I know I'm oversimplifying, but I'm doing so that you can clarify, it seems like there's a real split between the CIA and the DOD about whether we want to back Al-Qaeda more or less back Al-Qaeda through our allies and all those caveats in Syria. And the DOD, I don't know if they take it personally, the attack on the Pentagon back 16 years ago still, or exactly what their problem is, but they still seem to not be over their hatred of Al-Qaeda. Maybe it was the 4,500 of them that got killed fighting the Sunni insurgency in Iraq War II. The CIA apparently doesn't give a damn. But then both sides cry to Nancy Youssef at the Daily Beast about it and say, Nancy, those guys are backing our enemies and we want them to stop.
Right. Well,
and yet Carter seems like he's on the side of the CIA, not the DOD. So what's going on there?
Okay. Good question. Good point. Two things. One, first of all, Ash Carter's real interest here has nothing to do with Syria. Again, it has to do with DOD's interests. And what's the primary interest the DOD has in Russia? It is continuing the new Cold War. So what Ash Carter's concerned about is that if the Obama administration were to sign up to a real joint military effort with the Russians, that would be a big blow to the new Cold War. And so he's simply not going to buy into that at all. So I think that's the primary concern. Now, the secondary question here, or a second question, let me put it that way, is this consideration of what's going on with regard to U.S. military cooperation with the Kurds. And that has to do with not just al-Nusra Front, but even more so with cooperation with the Kurds against ISIS. The Kurds have become, the primary military force apart from Assad against ISIS.
In Syria, anyway, yeah.
In Syria, yeah. Right. And so, that's where particularly, this is not so much Ash Carter, but the military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military who are carrying out the war against ISIS are, of course, very close to the Kurds in that regard. And that's why I think you get this military versus CIA conflict.
Well, I always hear different versions, Gareth, of just how separate JSOC's chain of command is from the rest of the military. And I guess it changes back and forth, whether they're really under the chiefs or whether they're the president's private army, on their own chain of command, or how exactly that works.
I think it depends on where, the location of where they're involved. In the case of Syria, I think they're probably much more closely linked into the chain of command, the military chain of command, than they would have been in Afghanistan, for example.
But you're still saying that the split between them and the Secretary of Defense can still be pretty great when they're in the middle of a mission like this.
Absolutely, yeah, I think so. I mean, in other words, particularly if the Secretary of Defense is talking about avoiding cooperation with the Russians to go against al-Nusra Front and inevitably against ISIS as well. In other words, there would be a combination of cooperation against al-Nusra Front as well as against ISIS. And so definitely that would be a conflict.
And remind me one more time, Gareth, al-Nusra Front and their leadership are sworn loyal to the person and the goals of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, the butcher of New York City, hiding out in Pakistan somewhere right now?
Yeah, in Al-Qaeda's political culture, there is such a thing as, I think it's called al-Bayat. Allegiance is a very important concept. And you either have it or you don't. If you don't, then it's a very serious matter. If you break off, this is a big deal. And so, there have been efforts within al-Nusra Front. I mean, reportedly, there is a faction that has tried to get al-Jalani, the head of al-Nusra Front, to agree to cut off his relationship to al-Qaeda or to cease his loyalty, his allegiance to al-Zawahiri. And that's failed. I mean, clearly, he's never been interested in that. He's never been willing to cease to pledge his allegiance to the head of Al-Qaeda. So that's a key fact here. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. The fly on the wall thing seems like it would be a lot of fun, but I want to really crawl inside the mind of Ashton Carter for a minute here and try to figure out how picking a fight with Russia is a higher priority, is such a high priority that never mind that we're backing everyone who's backing the al-Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, in Syria. I mean, isn't that high treason?
Well,
isn't it?
It's not treason within the system, of course, as you know very well. You and I agree that many of the things that have been done in the name of national security should be considered treasonous. I hold no.
Again, no secret Muslim conspiracy here, but they're still backing our enemies, yours and mine, the civilians of the land between Mexico and Canada. They
Right.
made these enemies for us, and they just keep making them and making them. When they're fighting them, they're making them, and when they're backing them, they're making them even more than that.
Well, but then, it's not just Ashton Carter, of course. It's the entire national security bureaucracy that signed on to the strategy of cooperating with our regional allies in backing the army of conquest in Idlib province, which was the reigning U.S. strategy in Syria from 2014 up till relatively recently, and to some extent, there's at best ambiguity about it today. I mean that's still as far as I can see a de facto U.S. policy in Syria. So again, I mean this is the way they have decided to pursue U.S. interests in Syria for a variety of bureaucratic and domestic political interests that have produced the result. But I think that if you're looking for a reason for this, for Ashton Carter to take that position, it's very simple. That's where the money is in the military budget. The military budget is such that you have to have what they call near peer rivals to justify the kind of spending that we have been indulging and continuing to indulge in the military budget. It's China and Russia that provide the rationale for backing hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of spending well into the future.
What would they ever do if they got their regime change? What would they ever do if they put another Yeltsin in charge in Russia, did some kind of color-coded thing in China, and put their sock puppets in charge of these last two independent powers on Earth? Then who are they going to target? India?
No, then they're in the soup. Then you see what happened after the end of the Cold War. They had to suffer a very severe loss of budget, and that's what they're determined not to have happen again. That was a very serious problem for them for many, many years. They were in the darkness, as it were. They were out in the desert, suffering from lack of military budget. And so, when they saw the possibility, when Putin began to respond to an aggressive NATO stance, in Europe, they saw the rationale for a new Cold War, and I think that's what we're seeing in practice here. And they're determined not to let go of that. And that's the primary motivation for Ashton Carter and the staff of the Office of the Secretary of Defense at this point. And to a considerable extent, of course, Joint Chiefs of Staff are in the same place, but they also have a war to fight in Syria, and that provides a counterweight to some extent to that consideration.
Mm. So now, wait a minute. If we rewind it all back to the 92 Defense Plan and Guidance and rebuilding America's defenses and this and that and the other thing, is it fair to say then that the whole Middle East war, Iraq War II, and everything since then is all part of a proxy war with Russia? Still, just like the days of the USSR?
No, I think you have to distinguish between what was going on in the planning, the run up to the Iraq invasion in 2003, as well, of course, as the first Gulf War. These were wars that were fought for different reasons, but to a considerable extent in the knowledge that this was a way of ensuring two things. One, that you would have a sort of permanent war state that would justify much higher levels of military budget than would otherwise be the case. In both the first Gulf War and the Iraq War, this was a huge part of the rationale within the military and within the office of the Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld specifically. Okay, that's what he had in mind. I've never written about this, but I have a lot of information which I someday will write about how Rumsfeld's position on the invasion of Iraq was very strongly shaped by the need for a fix on how to be able to fund a whole new generation or generations to come of high-tech weaponry, while at the same time having a way of carrying out regime change in Iraq. And he was offered that opportunity to accomplish both those things by the Air Force strategy of shock and awe. Basically the Air Force strategy of carrying out regime change by air power without having any significant ground force footprint in the country. So that was a military budget problem that he had, and he was solving that by the invasion of Iraq.
All right, but so now we know that when Richard Pearl says real men go to Tehran, that, he's speaking for Ariel Sharon there, but, well, wait a minute now. I think you agree that was initially part of the plan that they thought they were going to be able to get away with, is going straight to Syria and Iran too. And was that, they weren't thinking about Putin and breaking Iran away from Russia at that point? That was just, they were really just thinking about Israel. Or thinking about overall weapons sales.
I don't think that they were consciously thinking about the relationship between Iran and Russia. No, absolutely not.
Okay.
No.
Because, Iran is one of Russia's last kind of, dependent sort of allied states, right? They have very few
you can't really use an ally or alliance in talking about Iran and Russia. No. That's not going to work because they've never trusted one another at any moment. It's been
there's a lot of bad blood there, I understand too.
Very, very shaky relationship. So you really can't use alliance at all for that.
But it wouldn't make sense if I was Douglas, forget him. If I was Richard Pearl or Paul Wolfowitz to say, it would weaken Russia's position a bit if we had our guy back in power in Tehran.
Yeah, sure. That could be thrown into the mix in the discussion in the National Security Council, but that's not the primary thought at all. That's not the primary thrust of the planning for the war in Iraq.
Sure. All right. Well, good deal, man. Thank you very much for doing the show as always, Gareth. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure as always, Scott.
And I know the audience really appreciates it too, because they tell me. That's the great Gareth Porter, everybody. This one is at consortiumnews.com and at antiwar.com. It's called A New Fight Over Syria War Strategy. It's a really important piece. I hope you'll go look at it. Again, it's at antiwar.com right now. And that's the Scott Horton Show. Check out the archives at scotthorton.org. Sign up for the podcast feed there. Help support at scotthorton.org/donate. And follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show.
Hey y'all, Scott Horton here for WallStreetWindow.com. Mike Swanson knows his stuff. He made a killing running his own hedge fund and always gets out of the stock market before the government-generated bubbles pop, which is, by the way, what he's doing right now, selling all his stocks and betting on gold and commodities. Sign up at WallStreetWindow.com and get real-time updates from Mike on all his market moves. It's hard to know how to protect your savings and earn a good return in an economy like this. Mike Swanson can help. Follow along on paper and see for yourself. WallStreetWindow.com. Hey, I'll check out the audiobook of Lou Rockwell's Fascism versus Capitalism, narrated by me, Scott Horton, at Audible.com. It's a great collection of his essays and speeches on the important tradition of liberty. From medieval history to the Ron Paul Revolution, Rockwell blasts our statist enemies, profiles our greatest libertarian heroes, and prescribes the path forward in the battle against Leviathan. Fascism versus Capitalism by Lou Rockwell for audiobook. Find it at Audible, Amazon, iTunes, or just click in the right margin of my website at scotthorton.org. Hey, y'all, Scott here. First, I want to take a second to thank all the show's listeners, sponsors, and supporters for helping make the show what it is. I literally couldn't do it without you. And now I want to tell you about the newest way to help support the show. Whenever you shop at Amazon.com, stop by ScottHorton.org first, and just click the Amazon logo on the right side of the page. That way the show will get a kickback from Amazon's end of the sale. It won't cost you an extra cent. And it's not just books. Amazon.com sells just about everything in the world, except cars, I think. So whatever you need, they've got it. Just click the Amazon logo on the right side of the page at ScottHorton.org or go to ScottHorton.org/Amazon.